Hi, welcome to part 2 of my video help on the events leading to the Civil War. Let's go. On January 21st, 1850, Henry Clay, now a senator from Kentucky, trudged through a Washington snowstorm to pay an unexpected call on Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. Clay, the creator of the Missouri Compromise, had come up with a plan to end the deadlock over California. But to get his plan through Congress, Clay needed Webster's support. Clay's new compromise had something to please just about everyone. It began by admitting California to the Union as a free state. That would please the North. Meanwhile, New Mexico and Utah would be organized as territories open to slavery, which would please the South. In addition, Clay's plan ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Although slaveholders in Washington would be able to keep their slaves, human beings would no longer be bought and sold in the nation's capital. Clay and Webster agreed that this compromise would win the support from abolitionists without threatening the rights of slaveholders. Finally, Clay's plan called for the passage of a strong fugitive slave law. Slaveholders had long wanted such a law, which would make it easier to find and reclaim their runaway slaves. Hoping that Clay's compromise would end the crisis, Webster agreed to help push it through Congress. But despite his support, Congress debated Clay's proposals for 9 frustrating months. As tempers frayed, Southerners talked of simply leaving the Union peacefully. Webster dismissed such talk as foolishness. Secession, peaceable succession, he exclaimed. Your eyes and mine never doesn't see that miracle. I see it as plainly as I see the sun in heaven. I see that secession must produce such a war as I will not describe. A war over slavery, that was something few Americans wanted to face. In September 1850, Congress finally adopted Clay's plan. Most Americans were happy to see the crisis end. Some Southerners, however, remained wary of the Compromise of 1850. A North Carolina newspaper warned the North to let this question of slavery alone, take it out, and keep it out of Congress, and respect and enforce the fugitive slave law as it stands. If not, we will leave you. Clay and Webster hoped that the Compromise of 1850 would quiet the slavery controversy for years to come. In fact, it satisfied almost no one. Instead of quieting down, the debate grew louder each year. Both sides were unhappy with the fugitive slave law, though for different reasons. Northerners did not want to enforce the law. Southerners felt that the law did not do enough to ensure them the return of their escaped property. Under the fugitive slave law, any person arrested as runaway had almost no legal rights. Many runaways fled to Canada rather than to risk being caught and sent back to their masters. Others decided to stand and fight. Reverend Jermaine Logren, a former slave living in New York, said boldly, I don't respect this law, I don't fear it, I won't obey it. I will not live like a slave, and if force is employed to re-enslave me, I shall make preparations to meet the crisis as becomes a man. The fugitive slave law also said that any person who helped a slave escape or even refused to aid slave catchers would be jailed. This provision, complained New England poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, made slave catchers of all. Opposition to the law was widespread in the North. When slave catchers came to Boston, they were hounded by crowds of angry citizens shouting, Slave hunters! There go the slave hunters! And after a few days of this treatment, most slave catchers decided to leave. Northerners' refusal to support the law infuriated slaveholders. It also made enforcement of the law almost impossible. Of tens of thousands of fugitives living in the North during the 1850s, only 299 were captured and returned to their owners. On a wintry Sunday morning in 1851, Harriet Beecher Stowe was sitting in church when a horrifying vision played across her eyes. Stowe raced home and scribbled down what she had seen. There she gathered her children around her and read what she had written. Her vision began with a saintly slave known as Uncle Tom and his cruel master Simon Legree. In a furious rage, Legree had his old slave whipped to death. Just before Uncle Tom's soul slipped out of his bloodied body, he opened his eyes to whisper to Legree, You poor miserable critter, there ain't no more you can do. I forgive you with all my soul. When she had finished reading, Stowe cried out, Son cried out, Oh, Mama, slavery is the cruelest thing in the world. The scene of the old slave's death became part of a much longer story entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin. The story was first published in installments in an abolitionist newspaper. In one issue, readers shared the pain of Uncle Tom's first owner, a kind slaveholder named Colonel Shelby. Unable to pay his debts, Shelby was forced to sell Uncle Tom away from his family. The cruelty of this action drove Shelby's wife to cry out, This is God's curse on slavery. I was a fool to think I could make anything good out of such a deadly evil. In a later issue, terrified readers held their breath as the beautiful slave Eliza chose to risk death rather than be sold away from her young son. Chased by slave hunters and their dogs, Eliza dashed to freedom across the ice-choked Ohio River, clutching her child in her arms. Later still, Stowe's reader found themselves weeping as Uncle Tom met his death at the hands of Simon Legree. By this time, most of them agreed with Stowe's son that slavery was the cruelest thing in the world. In 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published as a novel. Plays based on the book toured the country, thrilling audiences with Eliza's dramatic escape scene to freedom. No other work had ever aroused such powerful emotions about slavery. In the South, the novel and its author were scorned and cursed. In the North, Uncle Tom's Cabin turned millions of people against slavery. In early 1854, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois was introduced a bill in Congress that would have far-reaching consequences. Douglas had no intention of opening up another painful debate on slavery. He simply wanted to get a railroad built to California. This was more likely to happen, he thought, if Congress organized the Great Plains into the Nebraska Territory and opened it to settlers. Because this territory lay north of the Missouri Compromise, his bill said nothing about slavery. Southerners in Congress agreed to support Douglas's bill if he made a few changes. His final bill created two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. It also scrapped the Missouri Compromise by leaving it up to settlers themselves to decide what to do about slavery in the two territories. In other words, the bill opened up the territories to slavery, provided voters approved. Douglas called this policy popular sovereignty, or the rule by people. Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act hit the North like a thunderbolt. Once again, Northerners were haunted by nightmares of visions of slavery marching across the plains. Douglas tried to calm their fears by saying that the climates in Kansas and Nebraska were not suited to slave labor. But when the Northerners studied the maps, they were not so sure. Newspaper editor Horace Greeley charged in the New York Tribune, the pretense of Douglas and company that not even in Kansas is to be made a slave state by his bill is a gag, joke. Ask any Missourian what he thinks about it. The Kansas Territory is bounded in its entire length by Missouri, with the whole tier of slave counties leaning against it. Won't be a slave state. Gentlemen, don't lie anymore. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, settlers poured into Kansas. Most were peaceful farmers looking for fertile soil. Some settlers, however, moved to Kansas either to support or oppose slavery. In the South, towns took up collections to send their young men to Kansas. In the North, abolitionists raised money to send weapons to anti-slavery settlers. Before long, Kansas had two competing governments, one for slavery and one against it. The struggle over slavery soon turned violent. On May 21, 1856, pro-slavery settlers formed border ruffians from Missouri invaded Lawrence, Kansas, the home of anti-slavery government. The invaders burned a hotel, looted several homes, and tossed the presses of two abolitionist newspapers into the Kaw River. As the invaders left Lawrence, one of them boasted, "Gentlemen, this is the happiest day of my life." The raid on Lawrence provoked a wave of outrage in the North. Money was quickly raised to replace the destroyed presses. A more free soilers, as the anti-slavery settlers were called, prepared to move to Kansas. Meanwhile, a fiery abolitionist named John Brown plotted his own revenge. So 2 days after the Lawrence raid, Brown and seven followers, included Brown's son and his son-in-law, invaded the pro-slavery town of Pottawatomie. There they dragged 5 men they suspected of supporting slavery from their homes and hacked them to death with swords. The violence in Kansas greatly disturbed Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. To Sumner, it was proof, what he had long suspected, that Senator Stephen Douglas had plotted with Southerners to make Kansas a slave state. In 1856, Sumner voiced his suspicions in a passionate speech entitled "The Crime Against Kansas." Using harsh, shocking language, Sumner described the crime against Kansas as a violent assault on an innocent territory, compelling it to the hateful embrace of slavery. He dismissed Douglas as a noisome, squat, and nameless animal. Sumner also heaped abuse on many Southerners, including the distinguished Senator Andrew B. Butler of South Carolina. Just what Sumner hoped to accomplish was not clear. However, copies of his speech were quickly printed up for distribution in the North. After reading it, New England poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow congratulated Sumner on the brave, noble speech you made, never to die out in the memories of men. Certainly, it was not about to die out in the memories of enraged Southerners. 2 days after his speech, Senator Butler's nephew, South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks, attacked Sumner in the Senate, beating him with his cane until it broke in half. By the time other senators could pull Brooks away, Sumner had collapsed, unconscious and bloody. Reactions to the attack on Sumner showed how badly divided the country had become. Many Southerners applauded Brooks for defending the honor of his family in the South. From across the South, supporters sent Brooks new canes to replace the one he had broken over Sumner's head. Most Northerners viewed the beating as another example of Southerners' brutality. In their eyes, Brooks was no better than pro-slavery bullies who had attacked the good people of Lawrence. One Connecticut student was so upset that she wrote something about going to war. "I don't think it is very much use to stay any longer in the high school," she wrote. "The boys would be learning better to hold muskets and the girls to make bullets." In 1857, the slavery controversy shifted from the bloodied floor of Congress to the Supreme Court. The court was about to decide a case concerning a Missouri slave named Dred Scott. Years earlier, Scott had traveled with his owner into Wisconsin, where slavery was banned by the Missouri Compromise. Upon his return to Missouri, Scott went to court to win his freedom. He argued that his stay in Wisconsin had made him a free man. There were 9 justices on the Supreme Court in 1857. 5 of them, including Chief Justice Roger Taney, were from the South. 4 were from the North. The justices had 2 key decisions to decide. First, as a slave, was Dred Scott a citizen who had the right to bring a case before a federal court? Second, did his time in Washington make him a free man? Taney, however, hoped to use the Scott case to settle the slavery controversy once and for all, and so he asked the court to consider 2 more questions. Did Congress have the power to make any laws at all concerning slavery in the territories? And if so, was the Missouri Compromise a constitutional use of that power? On March 6, 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney prepared to deliver the most important decision of his career. Nearly 80 years old, the Chief Justice had long been opposed to slavery. As a young Maryland lawyer, he had publicly declared that slavery is a blot upon our national character, and every lover of freedom confidently hopes that it will be wiped away. True to his words, Taney had gone on to free his own slaves. Many observers wondered whether he and his fellow justices would now free Dred Scott as well.